You didn't join Napoleon's army to become a hero. You were drafted. A farmer, a blacksmith, maybe a clerk. 19 years old, still more boy than man. You got a letter from the Republic, or from the Empire later on, and that was it. You packed what little you owned and walked to the nearest depot. By the end of that week, you belonged to the Grande Armée. At first, you were just a man. Soft hands, a body used to short days and full meals. Then the training began. You marched until your shoulders bled from the pack straps. You drilled until your muscles twitched in your sleep. You ate dry bread, drank sour wine, and learned to keep moving long after your legs stopped listening. The weak collapsed. The rest adapted. Napoleon didn't just build an army. He built a system that turned civilians into endurance machines. Each new conscript became fuel for a moving empire, an organism that lived off the land, devoured distance, and fed on hardship. By 1804, that organism stretched across the continent. Hundreds of thousands of men from France, Italy, the Netherlands, Poland, and Germany, all marching under the same eagles, carrying the same weight, eating the same dust. They moved faster than any army before them. They won battles because they arrived before anyone believed they could. You entered as a man. You came out either dead or different. Before Napoleon, European warfare was slow, predictable, and in a weird sense, almost polite. Wars were guided by rules, not just unwritten traditions, but actual codes. By the mid-17th century, there were entire manuals on proper conduct in battle. Maurice de Saxe's Reveries on the Art of War of 1756, and Frederick the Great's Instructions for His Generals of 1747, were basically the playbooks of European combat. They taught officers how to deploy troops, how to engage, even when not to fight. Frederick warned against unnecessary bloodshed and insisted that war should be fought with calm precision. Maurice de Saxe wrote that soldiers should advance in order and dignity, keeping formation as a mark of discipline. So yeah, there was a literal code of war. Battles were almost contractual. Two armies agreed on a time and place, lined up and fought according to expectation. No surprises, no total war, no chaos. Two lines of brightly colored men, red, blue, white, facing each other maybe 100 yards apart. Drums beating, flags waving, officers shouting orders in perfect cadence. Then, on command, both sides would fire volleys straight into the opposing line. Reload, fire again. Reload, fire again. It was mechanical, and it was utter madness. You didn't shoot to aim, you shot to hold formation. Bravery meant not flinching while the man next to you took a bullet to the face. And honestly, you have to wonder, how did anyone agree to that? To just stand there, in the wide open, shoulder to shoulder, waiting for the other side to shoot. No trenches, no cover, no chance to dodge, just discipline and nerves of steel. Thank God muskets back then were wildly inaccurate. Smoothbore barrels, weak powder, and thick smoke. You could fire a dozen shots and maybe hit someone once. That's probably the only reason these battles didn't turn into instant massacres. It was war as ritual, a contest fought by rules and officers' pride, where the common soldier was more tool than human. A clash of rulers, not of nations. Then came the French Revolution, and with it, an entirely new kind of chaos. Millions of civilians turned soldiers, with no respect for those old rules. Before Napoleon could turn men into machines, he needed men. And thankfully for him, France had plenty, especially in proportion to most European countries. At the turn of the 19th century, Europe wasn't the neat set of nations we know today. Germany didn't exist yet. Italy didn't either. The continent was still a patchwork of duchies, kingdoms, and tiny states. Hundreds of them, each with its own ruler, laws, borders, and armies. Even the so-called empires like Austria and Spain were more like loose collections of territories than unified countries. France, though, was different. By 1800, it was centralized, reformed, and young. The revolution had wiped away much of the old feudal order, and Napoleon inherited a state that could actually count its people, and conscript them. France had around 29 to 30 million inhabitants, making it the largest single population west of Russia. That was roughly 1/6 of Europe's total at the time. To put that in perspective, Britain had around 16 million people. Austria, about 24 million. Prussia, barely 10 million. Spain, roughly 11 million. And Russia, vast, underdeveloped, and slow to mobilize, had about 40 million, spread across an empire that took months to move through. France's population was dense, organized, and trackable, thanks to the new census system started in 1801. That meant Napoleon actually knew how many men he could draft, where they were, and could mobilize them at any given moment. He didn't have to beg dukes for troops like other monarchs. He could simply order them, and because the country was so full demographically, he didn't need to scrape the bottom of the barrel. He drew from the strong middle, men in their late teens to early 30s, rural, healthy, used to long labor days and poor diets. That gave him a pool of about 5 to 6 million men of fighting age, fit to be molded. At his peak around 1812, Napoleon could mobilize close to 2.6 million men under arms across France and its allied states, nearly 1 in every 10 adult males in his empire. That constant flow of recruits made it possible to replace losses faster than anyone else in Europe, which meant he could push his soldiers harder than anyone else dared. But numbers weren't enough. Napoleon's genius wasn't just raising an army, it was conditioning it. He understood that endurance could beat elegance, that speed could crush size, that the army's power wouldn't come from supply chains or cavalry charges. It would come from the human body. So he built what were basically the training labs of modern warfare, the Boulogne camps. From 1803 to 1805, tens of thousands of conscripts were stationed along the French coast, officially to prepare for an invasion of Britain. In reality, they were being reshaped, physically, mentally, and systematically. Every day was a cycle of movement and deprivation. Drill, march, drill again. 20 kilometers a day under full pack, in all weather. March in formation, build camp, cook, break camp, march again. No supply wagons trailing behind, no comfort to return to. Officers drilled not just obedience but reflex. They trained soldiers to change formation on command. Line, column, square, as one synchronized organism. Every mistake was repeated until it became muscle memory. Letters from recruits tell the rest. One wrote that he had not taken off his shoes in 3 weeks. Another described men collapsing mid-drill, only to be kicked back to their feet. The Bologna system was about breaking limits. The men lived in a loop of little rest, minimal food, and constant repetition. They woke before sunrise, marched under full pack, trained until exhaustion, and collapsed on the same muddy ground they'd be marching over the next day. This routine pushed their bodies past comfort and into adaptation. Modern physiology would call it chronic exertion. Their cardiovascular systems expanded, their legs and tendons hardened, and their bodies learned to recover while still in motion. The constant sleep and food deprivation built what sports psychologists today call stress resilience, the ability to perform under fatigue without panic or hesitation. Day after day of the same drills forged muscle endurance and coordination at a scale Europe had never seen. They weren't just learning tactics, they were reshaping their nervous systems to obey under pressure. Napoleon didn't know sports science, but he understood suffering. He famously said,
"Un soldat doit apprendre à souffrir,"
which translates to a soldier must learn to suffer. And at Boulogne, they did. In his letters, he even doubled down by saying,
La première qualité du soldat est la constance à supporter la fatigue. La valeur n'est que la seconde.
Which translates to, the first quality of the soldier is the constancy to endure fatigue. Valor is only second. He didn't want men who avoided pain. He wanted men who expected it. Pain was part of the job description. A job that, mind you, you didn't get to choose. Hunger, exhaustion, blisters, all normal. In his army, comfort wasn't a right. It was a weakness. If anything, Boulogne wasn't just a training camp. It was the world's first military laboratory, a living experiment in endurance. By the time those men left for campaign, they weren't recruits anymore. They were early industrial age athletes, trained before the word athlete even existed. By the time those camps dissolved into campaigns, the Grande Armée wasn't just an army anymore. It was a human machine, mobile, efficient, self-sustaining. They could march farther, fight longer, and recover faster than any force Europe had ever seen. And that's what made Napoleon unstoppable. He didn't invent new weapons. He reinvented the human engine behind them. Once the forging was done, the test began. Everything Napoleon drilled into his men at Boulogne now had to survive the road, thousands of miles of it. When the Grande Armée moved, the world shook. Columns of soldiers poured across Europe like living rivers of mud and iron. They didn't wait for wagons or weather, they just went. Most European armies could manage 10, maybe 15 kilometers a day, before their men or their mules broke down. Napoleon's could do 25 to 30 kilometers, sometimes 40, every day, and still fight when they arrived. That wasn't logistics, that was physiology turned strategy. Each man hauled his life on his back. A musket, cartridges, uniform, bedroll, tent piece, tools, and a few days of rations. Nearly 30 kilos of empire on his shoulders. They moved at a rhythm learned in training. Step, breathe, the same beat that had been hammered into them on the French coast. No vehicles, no support lines. Napoleon trusted the men themselves to be the supply chain. They carried what they could and found the rest along the way, looting, trading, or scavenging food from the countryside. That's what let him move faster than any army before him. And when speed became a weapon, distance became a trap for everyone else. He could strike before the enemy even realized he was coming. To generals used to tidy battle schedules and long supply delays, it looked supernatural. To his soldiers, it was just another march. This constant motion hardened them beyond anything Europe had seen. Feet bleeding through worn boots, available only in 3 sizes, no left or right foot, they'd mold during the march. No repairs as well. Soldiers took care of it themselves. Quite often, they used cowhides wrapped around their feet, with the hair turned outward. Their uniforms were soaked for weeks. Sleep reduced to minutes stolen in ditches, and still they kept the pace. Their bodies didn't need recovery anymore. Movement was their recovery. Modern endurance studies would call this adaptive fatigue. Keep the load, keep the motion, and the body stops fighting it. It becomes the new normal. Napoleon's men lived inside that state permanently. They were described as the legs of France, and it wasn't a metaphor. Those legs carried the empire from Lisbon to Moscow. And when the cannons thundered, those same legs charged straight through the smoke, because they already knew pain, and they knew it passed. That was the secret. All that suffering in Boulogne wasn't preparation, it was programming. By the time the campaigns began, endurance wasn't something they tried to summon. It was simply who they were. But all that marching came with a cost. You can only burn so much before you run out of fuel. And Napoleon's men burned everything. Calories, muscle, even sanity. They moved too fast for supply lines to catch up, too far for France to feed them. Soon the empire's greatest strength, its mobility, became its greatest hunger. From the fields of Germany to the frozen plains of Poland, soldiers learned that survival wasn't about fighting. It was about finding something to eat. Napoleon's army didn't live off rations. It lived off momentum. The faster his soldiers moved, the less they could carry. Supply wagons slowed everything down, and Napoleon hated slow. So he built his strategy on a gamble. His men would feed themselves along the way. And they did. Sort of. Officially, a French infantryman was supposed to receive about a pound of bread a day, a small portion of meat or beans, and some wine or brandy. That's maybe 2,000 calories, half of what a marching soldier actually needed. In practice, those rations rarely arrived. Convoys got lost, stolen, or burned. By the time they reached the front, there was usually nothing left but crumbs and paperwork. So the army adapted. They called it la maraude, the hunt for food. Each regiment, sometimes each man, foraged whatever he could find. They raided farms, barns, and villages. Sometimes they paid. Most times they didn't. In rich lands, like northern Italy or the Rhineland, they feasted on bread, cheese, and wine. In poor regions, or enemy territory, they boiled horse meat, ate bark soup, even chewed on their own leather belts. Napoleon didn't mind. As long as the army moved, the empire lived. And to keep it moving, he accepted hunger as part of the system. Food wasn't nutrition, it was morale. A crust of bread and a sip of brandy could carry a man another 10 kilometers. Wine was safer than water and stronger than hope. Letters from soldiers talk about sharing a single bottle among 10 men, drinking it like medicine. Modern science would call this survival metabolism. Constant caloric deficit, high energy output. The body learns to burn everything it has. Fat disappears first, then muscle, then whatever it takes to keep the legs moving. It's the same principle behind ultra-endurance events, except these men weren't running marathons. They were fighting them. The result was a kind of brutal efficiency. Napoleon's men were lean, wiry, almost carved down to purpose. A generation of walking endurance machines. They weren't built for strength, they were built for continuation. But that came at a cost. Disease spread fast when men were starving. Scurvy, dysentery, and fever hit harder than enemy fire. And when the army entered regions stripped of food, like Poland in winter or Russia in 1812, the system collapsed. You can't live off the land when the land is frozen. Still, for nearly a decade it worked. Napoleon's troops could move twice as fast as their enemies, strike where no one expected, and survive on half the food. Every battle they won was paid for in hunger. They weren't just soldiers anymore. They were predators, marching on empty stomachs, devouring Europe one meal at a time. By the time the wars reached their peak, Napoleon's veterans weren't just soldiers. They were something else entirely. They were Grognards, the grumblers. The name started as a joke in the Imperial Guard, the elite corps closest to Napoleon himself. They complained about everything: the food, the mud, the endless marches, but they never stopped fighting. Over time, Grognard became a title of honor. It meant you'd seen it all and survived it all. You'd eaten horse meat in Poland, marched barefoot through Spain, slept standing in Germany, and still shown up when the drum started. These men weren't fearless. They were just past the point where fear mattered. They'd learned that pain was temporary, but reputation was forever. They marched, fought, and joked through conditions that would break most modern soldiers. Their humor was their armor. They sang songs about hunger, made fun of their officers, even mocked death itself. It wasn't rebellion, it was therapy. The only way to stay sane was to make the suffering ridiculous. Psychologists today would call it collective resilience. When pain becomes normal, sharing it makes it lighter. When an entire regiment suffers together, it stops feeling like punishment and starts feeling like belonging. The group spirit of every military now, born right there. Napoleon understood this perfectly. He fed their pride the same way he fed their bellies, in small, powerful doses. He remembered faces, names, the tiniest stories. He'd ride past a column and shout, "Ah, there's my old Grognard from Marengo." And that was enough to make a starving man stand taller. The veterans carried that loyalty like a religion. They grumbled about their emperor every day, but they would have died for him the moment he appeared. It wasn't patriotism, it wasn't duty, it was bonded suffering. When you survive years of hunger, frost, and marching alongside the same men, you don't fight for the flag anymore. You fight for the guy walking next to you, the one who shared his bread, his brandy, and his silence. That's what made Napoleon's army so dangerous. They weren't held together by discipline alone. They were held together by shared endurance, by the belief that no one else could suffer like they could. To them, pain wasn't a curse, it was proof. For all the talk of loyalty and grit, not everyone stayed in Napoleon's ranks. Desertion was the shadow of the Grande Armée, always there, just behind the myth. It wasn't rare, and it wasn't new. During the revolution before Napoleon took power, desertion was epidemic. Entire battalions melted away before even reaching the front, up to 20 or 30% in the worst years of the 1790s. France was drafting on chaos back then. Poor pay, no shoes, no food, no reason. By the time Napoleon took control, he tightened the system. The empire had order, census lists, and gendarmes. Desertion dropped to single digits in most French units, 2 to 5% a year on average, though it was always higher in foreign regiments or occupied territories. Across his reign, historians estimate hundreds of thousands of men deserted at some point. out of the millions who served. Enough to matter. Never enough to stop the machine. The reasons were endless. Hunger, homesickness, hopelessness. Some deserted because their families were starving. Some because they simply vanished into the marching fog. Many who were listed as deserters were probably just dead. Bodies lost in snow, mud, or paperwork. And Napoleon's system dealt with it brutally. Military police hunted deserters across France and Europe. If caught, punishment was quick. Prison, hard labor, or the firing squad. Families could be fined. Villages were pressured to turn them in. Still, when the army was bleeding men faster than it could count them, even deserters were sometimes forgiven and sent back into the line. In the Peninsular War, where supply was scarce and Spanish guerrillas made every road a death trap, desertion spiked again. Thousands disappeared into the hills or into graves. Then in Russia, the very idea of desertion lost meaning. When the army collapses from cold and starvation, running isn't rebellion, it's survival. And yet, for all those who fled, even more stayed. They stayed because they were too tired to run, or too proud, or too bound by the faces beside them. They grumbled, they cursed, they dreamed of home. But when the drums rolled, they still marched. That was Napoleon's paradox. He built an army so vast that it could bleed endlessly and still move. Desertion was a leak, but never a flood. The human engine kept going. But even the toughest machine has a breaking point. For years, Napoleon's men had marched farther, eaten less, and suffered more than any army on earth. They believed they could survive anything, and mostly they did. Then came Russia, and the machine met its first true enemy. Not an army, but a season. The French would give it a name, as if it were a commander in its own right. General Hiver. General Frost. Cold, silent, and undefeated. Napoleon led over 500,000 men into Russia, the largest army Europe had ever seen, a human tide stretching for miles. They crossed the Niemen River in summer heat, confident, seasoned, unstoppable. Most had marched across half the continent to get there. They thought this would be another victory. It wasn't. The Russian army refused to fight a traditional war. They retreated, burning everything behind them. Villages, barns, crops, all gone. Napoleon's soldiers, trained to live off the land, suddenly had nothing to live off. By the time they reached Moscow, the city was burning. No food, no shelter, no victory. Morale collapsed. The men hadn't won a single true battle. They were exhausted already from months of endless marching and empty promises. And then winter came early, and it came like a blade. Temperatures dropped to -30 degrees Celsius. Boots froze to feet, muskets jammed with ice, and men began collapsing where they stood. Some froze mid-step, locked upright as if still marching. Others tried to eat horse meat cooked over the fires of their own dead animals. They boiled leather, gnawed bark, drank snow, and they kept moving, because that's what Napoleon's soldiers did. They moved. Even starving, even dying, they stayed in formation. Officers wrote that men fell in silence, replaced immediately by the one behind. No mutiny, no chaos, just exhaustion, order, and death. Of the 500,000 who entered Russia, fewer than 100,000 made it out, and the retreat wasn't peaceful. As the army collapsed, Napoleon's so-called allies began to peel away. The Grande Armée hadn't been purely French. It was a patchwork of soldiers from across his empire. Poles, Germans, Italians, Dutch, Swiss, Croats. When the disaster struck, that coalition shattered. Entire battalions of Saxons and Westphalians deserted or surrendered. Prussian troops under General York signed their own truce with the Russians, switching sides in the middle of the retreat. Austrian officers followed suit soon after. What had marched into Russia as a unified empire now limped home through enemy territory. Every town, every forest, every village that had once opened its gates to Napoleon's eagles now closed them, or worse, attacked. Russian Cossacks harried the columns day and night. Local militias hunted stragglers. Even peasants with pitchforks joined in. But the retreat itself became legend. Somehow, even as their bodies failed, their discipline held the soldiers together. The same suffering that had built them now carried them through the impossible. Historians later called it a disaster, with good reasons. When they returned to France, limping, starving, hollow-eyed, people barely recognized them. But those who saw them knew. These were not men anymore. They were what came after men. Grognards reborn by winter. Even defeat couldn't erase what Napoleon had created. He hadn't just raised an army, he had pushed the limits of endurance itself. Napoleon didn't build an army of giants. He built an army of physically and mentally trained, starving predators, willing to do anything to survive. Men who marched farther, ate less, and suffered longer than anyone before them. They didn't conquer Europe with technology or strategy alone. They did it with muscle, lungs, and stubbornness. Every victory was carved out of exhaustion, every advance paid for in blisters and hunger. They turned pain into discipline, starvation into speed, and suffering into strength. And in doing so, they redefined what it meant to be a soldier, and maybe what it meant to be human. Because once you've seen men march thousands of kilometers, fight on empty stomachs, sleep in snow, and still show up for battle the next morning, you realize something. This wasn't about glory. It was about endurance. Napoleon's soldiers weren't superhuman. They were ordinary men pushed past what anyone thought was possible. Proof that the human body can adapt, survive, and even win under conditions meant to destroy it. They weren't made in gyms or academies. Even if all started there, they were made in mud, frost, and fire. Napoleon gave them the system. The rest, the pain, the will, the transformation, they gave themselves. 2 centuries later, their story still stands as one of the purest examples of human endurance ever recorded. They were underfed, underslept, overworked, and unstoppable. If you like this video, subscribe to the channel. Napoleon's soldiers weren't elite by birth or by blood. They were elite because they endured, because they were built different.